Are we live streamed? Are we live?
We will go live stream as soon as you tell Paul to do so.
Okay, and we're going to, and then probably start right at 11 o'clock, huh? That's probably the best idea.
We can wait for a couple of minutes if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've pushed the live stream, so you're ready to go whenever you want.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul.
Hi, Manu.
Oh, yeah, because maybe you should, yeah, that's right.
Maybe Bikram, you can set down the rules, you know, about keeping things muted and so on.
Sure. Okay.
And yeah, and sort of set out the, yeah, you know what I mean. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
the question and answer later and so on.
Sure. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting within a few minutes here, just to let everybody kind of trickle in. This is an event hosted by the International Manifesto Group. It's titled Imperialism, Anti-Imperialism, and the Structure of World Order. We have 5 speakers, including myself, or plus myself, 5 or 6 speakers, and we're going to start just in maybe 2-3 minutes. So I see a lot of people entering the room, and so I'll formally introduce the event in a couple of minutes. In the meanwhile, if you can please keep your mics muted if you're not speaking. And so yeah, just in about 2 or 3 minutes, I'll formally begin. Okay. I think we can get started. It seems like we have people still entering, but should I wait a couple minutes, Radhika? Is it okay to start?
We can start, I think.
Okay. All right. Good morning again, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So this is an event hosted by the International Manifesto Group, Imperialism, Anti-Imperialism, and the Structure of World Order. I think the theme of the event is pretty evident in the title. I'll just go over briefly the structure before I start describing the actual event. We're going to have 6 speakers, and then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards. And we kindly ask that when you are not speaking, please keep yourself muted. And please feel free to, I guess, you can ask questions, I'm sure, in the chat, or afterwards, you can raise your hand. So the event, as I was saying, it's there's 3 kind of key components in the title there: imperialism, anti-imperialism, and the structure of world order. The blurb has a brief description kind of suggesting that we're living in a context, as I'm sure is quite self-evident to many, where there is kind of endless chatter about world order. We hear that term a lot increasingly, and how whatever is the existing world order, it is under threat, it is under challenge, it is being uprooted by quote unquote either revisionist powers, or we often actually do even hear it in quite explicitly racial or civilizational terms, in terms of either a challenge to the West or the program adopted by the Joe Biden administration quite explicitly, which is a defense of the West, right? Which is quite often the language we hear in the Ukraine war, is that what's at stake is a defense of the West, which for some of us might recall Césaire's famous line that Europe is indefensible, but we can leave that maybe for the question and answer. So, well, the discussion, the meeting today is kind of really centered on the emerging debates, both academic, politically, around the significance of this challenge to world order. One thing that is just worth keeping in mind, although this has really picked up in the last 5 or 6 years, this is a recurring discussion, a recurring theme, right? This has actually been long-standing set of fears around a challenge, however the world order is framed. So, you can think about the last 5 years, but also after the financial crisis, there was a lot of anxiety around, again, framed in terms of the West declining and the rest rising, due to the ways in which different states recovered from the financial crisis. Of course, we know the narrative around the rise of the BRICS has extended to the beginning of the 2000s. Obviously, the rise of China has instigated a lot of these anxieties and tensions. The persistence of socialist projects in Cuba, Vietnam, and elsewhere as well. But if you were to dig into some of the archives, you'll find in the 1980s and the 1970s similar sort of anxieties, with somebody like Hedley Bull writing an essay called "The Revolt Against the West," right? So you have these constant returns. I think even in the 1920s and 30s, if you go back to those times, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution and the beginning of decolonization movements, this constant civilizational anxiety. And maybe there's 2 registers, right? An anxiety around the persistence of capitalism and the persistence of the domination of the West. And so these are, in the sense that they're long-standing, that suggests that there's a deeply rooted structure that is at question here, right? And that's, I think, maybe one element what we're going to focus on today, amongst others, is what exactly is at stake when there is this anxiety around a shifting world order. And those 2 terms we have in the title, imperialism and anti-imperialism, one theme will be the suggestion that this is actually a primary contradiction of both the contemporary world order and the shifting world order, and what might take its place, right? So what does it mean to think about an imperialist world order versus an anti-imperialist world order? And what would it mean to work towards a more multipolar anti-imperialist world system? So those are some questions we're gonna dig into, and I think we can start. We'll begin now with our first speaker, and Nina is here, Nina Farnia, yeah? Okay, I'm just going to, I'll introduce each speaker before they speak, and then we'll have about maybe 12 minutes to 15 minutes maximum, and I'm the final speaker, so if they go over a little over, I can cut my time a little bit as well, so 12 to 15 minutes if possible. Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker. Nina Farnia is a legal historian and scholar of critical race theory. Her scholarship examines the role of modern US imperialism in shaping domestic areas of law, with a particular focus on the rise of autocratic legalism. Her publications explore a variety of related subjects, including the role of US foreign affairs in shaping modern jurisdiction, the formation of the national security state, and the evolution of freedom of speech and religion. She is currently working on a book entitled Imperialism in the Making of US Law. Farnia has published in a wide range of academic journals and popular media outlets, including the Stanford Law Review, UCLA Women's Law Journal, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Geopolitical Economy Report, and the San Francisco Chronicle, among others. She currently serves as the secretary of the American Association of Law Schools section on Law and the Humanities, and is the co-chair of the International People's Tribunal on US Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Economic Coercive Measures. So I'm going to turn it over to Nina. I will give you a heads up, I guess, with about 2 to 3 minutes left, or yeah, okay. I'll give you a heads up with that thing.
Thank you all very much. And a special thanks to Radhika and Bikram and Brendan for organizing this and inviting us and bringing us all together. This is a great turnout, I think. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to the discussion later. So as Bikram said, I'm a legal scholar. I'm a historian, but also I'm a law professor. And so I spend my days with law students and lawyers. And so I'll be entering the discussion in a bit of from a different vantage point, I think, than we normally enter these conversations. As many of you probably know, a debate is raging right now among the intellectual class in the United States about whether the US is fascistic. Liberals, though they call themselves left, I like to call them the fake left, the faux left, like Daniel Besner in an article in the New Republic, historian Bruce Kuckler, and political theorist Corey Robin, are arguing that the conditions that presupposed European fascism don't apply to the United States now. These conditions include the presence of a strong and organized left on the verge of seizing power, and a broad experience of total war. Alternatively, intellectuals such as Angela Davis, Gerald Horne, and many others have long argued that the US has already arrived to fascism. They marshal the white supremacist, colonial, settler colonial, and imperial history of the US to make the overall claim. I don't think I need to tell you that the debate is deeply racialized. It's largely white scholars who are reluctant to call the US fascistic, even as they recognize the violence that created this nation and that continues to wreak havoc upon the lives of most of us. While Black scholars and other non-whites, what I like to call the people of the global majority, embrace the term as an accurate descriptor of the US and its future. Part of why Besner and the rest get it wrong is that they misidentify the preconditions of European fascism, basing it in the response to communism and completely disregarding the role of race and even a little bit of capital. Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov identified a different set of preconditions to fascism, conditions which by and large apply quite neatly to the contemporary United States. Number one, economic conditions. An economic crisis that leads to exceptional predation upon the working class. In the US context, this predation is racially stratified. Number two, political conditions. A disorganized working class that is easily divided by social democrats who practice class collaboration with the elite. Notably, the Social Democrats are the most aggressive force undermining a broad, united front against fascism. This is very actively happening in the United States right now. In fact, I think the Democratic Socialists of America has its national conference next weekend, and a group of Palestinian organizations came out with a very powerful statement telling the DSA, take a position on Zionism. So this is where the DSA is right now as bombs continue to fall on the Palestinians. The second condition under political conditions is a weak elite that is unable to manage and neutralize working people through elections and so-called democracy. While this condition has not fully realized itself, the January 6th coup attempt and the prosecution of a recent president are indications that the electoral system is no longer as effective as it once was at managing and neutralizing working people. This is in part due to ongoing white supremacy and the racialized divisions in the working class. And finally, international conditions. 3, the subjugation of other nations in order to resolve the problem of markets. An excellent example of this is the increasing reliance of the global north on sanctions, economic coercive measures, which are designed to remove productive global south economies from the market and maintain US and European market dominance. This is, of course, now, sanctions have also now begun to create a crisis for the US and Europe, but we can talk about that later because of the Russian sanctions and the rise of BRICS. Another point is the intensification of colonial repression, increasing militarism, 1,000 US military bases, drone strikes, hybrid warfare, etc., and the repartitioning of the world anew by means of war. What we're witnessing in Ukraine, what happened with Iraq, Syria, and Vietnam, what may happen, hopefully not, with Taiwan. These are the preconditions of fascism. Now, what is fascism? In 1933, the Communist International defined fascism as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, understood to mean racist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. Within a space like this, there may be principal disagreement about whether the US is proto-fascist or by virtue of its racial slavery, genocide, and colonialism, already fascist. I'm not going to answer that question. But what I will say is that fascist tendencies are always present, particularly in capitalist societies. In fact, there's no politically pure form of government that is void of either freedom, consent, or coercion. Every government and state system reflects all of these characteristics, even the US and even the governments that people like to call autocratic or authoritarian. What is key is that fascism looks different depending on the political context in which it evolves. Now I'm going to get to autocratic legalism and specifically the role of the law. I want to say a couple of things about the law. First, before I get to the theory, first, the law is not always a bourgeois liberal force. It can be whatever society makes of it. And virtually every society, not virtually, every society in the world, whether Islamic, communist, socialist, republican, democratic, authoritarian, has a legal system. These are the rules by which we relate to one another. They can be marshaled in a fascistic way. They can be marshaled in an equitable way. Every society has law. The other thing I want to talk about is the relationship between liberals and fascists. It's not a purely instrumental relationship. Liberals don't instrumentalize fascism to their ends. They actually are co-constitutive forces. They're co-creators. And that's why looking at the role of the law is critical in understanding the development and manifestation of fascism. According to Dimitrov, before the establishment of a fascist dictatorship, bourgeois governments usually pass through a number of preliminary stages and adopt a number of reactionary measures which directly facilitate the accession to power of fascism. This is precisely what many legal scholars are now calling autocratic legalism, what I define as the fascist capture of the state through the law. In the US case, the reactionary measures are designed to facilitate the accession to power of fascism by completely eliminating any opposition to it. There are a series of ways in which this is occurring, largely, though not exclusively, through the far-right Supreme Court as we speak. I'll start by describing cases that implicate what we call access to justice, the ability to file lawsuits and vindicate one's rights in court. I'll try to go through the cases quickly. So in a 2004 case, Chrysler versus Baumann, plaintiffs in Argentina filed suit against Mercedes-Benz in California federal court, alleging that Mercedes collaborated with the Argentine dictatorship to kidnap, detain, torture, and kill plaintiffs from 1976 to 1983 in what people often call Argentina's dirty war. The case reached the Supreme Court in 2014. The liberal justices on the court found that even though Mercedes-Benz operates in the US and has extensive business contacts with the US, it cannot be sued in US courts. There was no jurisdiction. And as we know, international courts have no enforcement mechanism. They're incredibly weak. So basically, Mercedes-Benz was immune. In a 2009 case, this is a very famous and very significant case, Ashcroft versus Iqbal, a citizen of Pakistan who was a cable company employee in New York, was arrested during the post 9/11 roundups and filed suit against the US government, challenging the racial profiling and harsh conditions of confinement he was subject to as a result of his race, religion, and national origin. Prior to this case, in order to file a lawsuit, you only needed very basic information, very basic factual allegations. This is because at the beginning of a lawsuit, you don't have evidence to prove your allegations. You get that evidence through a process that in the law is called discovery. Iqbal raised the standard to plausibility, meaning that when you file a lawsuit, all the allegations you make must be plausible. You must have basically some form of evidence. This makes it much harder to actually file lawsuits in the US, not just in the context of terrorism, but across the law. Post-Iqbal, the success of plaintiffs filing suits dropped down by 30% across different areas of the law. And Iqbal basically had the consequence of rendering racial profiling lawful. And local governments have relied on Iqbal to justify racial profiling. And of course, I don't think I'm going to mention, but I don't think I need to talk about what has happened with regard to abortion rights and affirmative action. For whatever reason, those two issues in particular are not on the radar of the so-called leftists who argue that the US is not fascistic. But both cases are designed to do exactly what the 1933 International suggested fascism does, suppress its opposition. Such suppression need not be through tasers and batons and jail cells. I'll start with talking about abortion rights. One of the reasons why women are dominating the workforce in higher education today is because our generations had the unequivocal right to choose. We weren't forced to stay home with children that resulted from unintended pregnancies, best case scenario, or rape or incest, which are both much more common than we think. But that will now change. Gerald Horne calls the attack on reproductive rights and on trans people in the US the manifestations of the current crisis of masculinity, a crisis driven by capitalism, which has resulted from the ascendance and dominance of women in the workforce and in education. Affirmative action has now been decimated by the US Supreme Court. The court found that it's unlawful, except, then does anybody know what the exception is to this? I mean, I know like Mateo and my friends know, but the exception is military academies. So schools of higher education can no longer use affirmative action in order to admit historically excluded groups like Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples. But military academies can, elite military academies especially. What this suggests, and what Justice Jackson put in her dissent, is that these young people are fit to die in US wars, but not fit to learn. And Cheryl Harris, a well-known critical race theorist many years ago, called the ongoing attacks on affirmative action a war on Black education, which began as soon as Africans landed on these shores, and it continues to this day. Denial of education is a key feature of the underdevelopment and depoliticization of a society. And the racial purges and blacklists that we're now seeing of Black intellectuals are part of a broader plan, not just to suppress and repress, but also to neutralize the masses, what I call the global majority, and also working people. So to conclude, going back to Bikram and Césaire, in 1950, Césaire wrote Discourse on Colonialism. He was concerned with the, quote, boomerang effect of colonialism upon Europe. He said, the Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, and discuss. People are surprised and they become indignant. The Holocaust, he said, was European colonialism turned inward. The stakes are quite high, not merely because some of us live in the United States and Europe, or because our children live here, but also because the US has an outsized and unfortunately outsized role in the world. And fascism here will reverberate in different ways globally, not just fueling social crises as it does now, but also planetary crises that will make our planet unlivable for future generations. So this naming game that the intellectuals I mentioned at the beginning of my talk are playing in their debates about whether or not to call the US fascist, in my opinion, is ridiculous. We can't and should not dupe ourselves into thinking that this is somehow less bad or less serious than what came before. If we do that, then what's to come will likely be far worse than anything we could ever have imagined. And with the climate crisis and the extraordinary heat that our peoples throughout the world are experiencing, that alone is proof enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Much appreciated. Our next speaker is Manu Karuka. Manu is an associate professor in American Studies at Barnard College and is the author of Empire's Tracks, Plains Indians, Chinese Migrants, and the Transcontinental Railroad. Manu, please go ahead.
Thanks, Bikram. I want to start by thanking our hosts and salute my co-panelists and everyone else on the Zoom. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. Can you hear me? Is this coming through? Okay. I'm going to focus on the moment of 1992 to think about our broader question, a moment of apparent victory for capitalism, and a moment which set into place habits of, let's say, the attrition or deterioration of class analysis and class politics, as well as the deterioration of organizational politics, and focus on the necessity of organization, which both put us in very difficult, dire circumstances at the moment now, in the crisis we're living through now. In comparison to war, ending with the withdrawal of forces from the battlefield, Gramsci argued that political struggle is enormously more complex. In political struggle, as in colonial warfare, the victorious army occupies or proposes to occupy permanently all or a part of the conquered territory, while the defeated army is disarmed and dispersed. As in situations of colonial occupation, however, the struggle continues on an altered terrain. Gramsci's insights can provide us an opening to consider the end of the Cold War in 1992. Much grander than the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama argued 1989 marked the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution through the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, claiming that the class issue has actually been successfully resolved in the West Fukuyama presented class struggle as an ideological relic of bygone times. The end of history for Fukuyama was the end of class struggle. Fukuyama's end of history was not only the triumph of capitalism over socialism, it was also the triumph of the West, of the Western idea, taking two forms. First, the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism, and second, the ineluctable spread of Western consumerist culture. Behind Fukuyama's triumphalism is the question of imperialism. 1989 for Fukuyama bookended the 20th century, which began and now returned to a state of self-confidence in the ultimate triumph of Western liberal democracy. The inheritors of the so-called great powers, now calling themselves the G7, celebrated an unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism. While the bulk of the third world, Fukuyama warned, remains very much mired in history, he concluded that the simple existence of communist China constitutes a threat to liberalism. In a November 1991 talk delivered at the Smith Center for Private Enterprise Studies at Cal State Hayward, Milton Friedman distinguished between economic, human, and political freedom. Friedman lauded Hong Kong as one of the freest, if not the freest, of countries in the world, blessed with a free market that had arisen from the designs of British colonial officials and a great deal of human freedom in the form of free speech and press freedoms. In one respect, Friedman conceded, Hong Kong had no freedom whatsoever. In a curious formulation, he suggested that Hong Kong residents did not choose freedom, it was imposed on them. This disjuncture between economic and political freedom also shaped his analysis of Chile, presenting the Pinochet dictatorship as a restoration of Chile's democratic process. As examples of economic freedom, Friedman offered colonial rule on the one hand and military dictatorship on the other. This may be resonant with Nina's analysis of fascism and capitalism. Against these spaces of economic freedom, Friedman alleged that India and other British colonies that were given political freedom, quote unquote, given political freedom in the post-war era, have for the most part destroyed economic and human freedoms. And he concluded that economic freedom facilitates political freedom, but political freedom has a tendency to destroy economic freedom. Gramsci had critically assessed the Italian communist movement's actions in the period prior to the rise of fascism. Avoiding the basic problem, the problem of power, the movement had instead diverted popular attention to secondary objectives, while hypocritically concealing the ruling class responsibility for the crisis. Diversion, concealment, and disunity also shaped certain theoretical perspectives at the close of the Cold War. In their 1987 essay, Post-Marxism Without Apologies, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe had anticipated Fukuyama's arguments about the obsolescence of Marxism, proclaiming that socialism needed to be reformulated through discursive struggles over rights and equality. Jettisoning class struggle at the heart of their proposed transcendence of Marxism is a basic consensus with Fukuyama's position. For Laclau and Mouffe, struggle is defined by qualities of variety and autonomy that align neatly with Friedman's free private market, so apparently indifferent to social identities. Post-Marxism counseled a bizarre kind of mysticism, predicting a transcendence of bourgeois power through the mechanisms of bourgeois power. In her 1993 essay, Feminism, Citizenship, and Radical Democratic Politics, Mouffe clarified both the turn away from class struggle and the engagement within the framework of liberal democracy, embedded in the call for post-Marxism, which she shared with Laclau. Class, in her approach, is a type of identity, an equivalent articulation with other identities, not a relationship within a given mode of production. Rather than class struggle, this was instead an amorphous model of struggle against what she called forms of subordination. Mouffe advocated a model of radical and plural democracy. Prior to capitalism, Gramsci noted, the ruling classes were essentially conservative, conceiving of themselves as a closed caste. The rising bourgeoisie, as an open, dynamic class, presented itself as culturally and economically capable of absorbing all of society. The state form of the bourgeoisie reflected this dynamism and openness. Over time, however, as this process of dynamism ground to a halt, the state returned to relations of pure force, As competition is replaced by monopoly and capitalism becomes moribund, the bourgeois class becomes saturated, in Gramsci's terms. It stops growing, beginning to shrink. The bourgeois state in the era of imperialism reflects these patterns of decay. What possibilities obtained for a radical plural democracy in an age of imperialism? In 1992, the central government of India under the Congress Party opened India's domestic economy to international financial capital, a policy of liberalization. At the end of the year, Hindutva forces demolished the Babri Masjid, a historic mosque in Ayodhya, in a brazenly criminal act of collective violence. Winter 1992 also saw the publication of Dipesh Chakrabarty's essay, Post-Coloniality and the Artifice of History. Conceding to Fukuyama that the end of history is in sight for us in India, Chakrabarty framed Indian history itself in a position of subalternity, while acknowledging that this position left him open to charges of nativism, nationalism, or worse, nostalgia. Chakrabarty would admit the real danger of an Indian Hindu fascism in a 1995 essay, while contending that this danger was sometimes exaggerated. In a pair of astonishingly prescient talks, the first given on December 27, 1992 in Calcutta, and the second in early December 1993 in Hyderabad, Ejaz Ahmed addressed these questions, cautioning against transporting ideas developed for a specific moment of struggle. Ahmed nonetheless asserted that a certain kind of ghostly resonance with the Indian situation could be found in a careful reading of Gramsci. Rather than the prototype of all bourgeois revolutions, Ahmed pointed out, the French Revolution was in fact a very notable exception. The increasing conservatism of the bourgeoisie across Europe following the French Revolution spurred a wave of national revolutions through alliances between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, presenting a united front against the threat of worker-peasant insurgencies. Ahmed insisted that ideological struggle against Hindutva would need to engage traditions of struggle inherited from pre-colonial anti-Brahmanical movements, alongside the legacies of the nationalist movement. Together, he argued, these histories imprinted the spiritual and political consciousness of tens of millions of rural households across India, shaping democratic traditions which had developed out of centuries of class struggle in Southern Asia. Ideological struggle in itself was insufficient to defeat Hindutva. In order to be credible, ideologies of secularism and democracy would need to take concrete form through struggles to radically restructure property relations and systems of governance, giving the popular classes a real, tangible stake in the anti-fascist struggle. The critical rejection of nation as a political category conceded the ground of social struggle. It marked a particularly sharp failure, in a Gramscian sense, in a moment of rise for the extreme right. Nation, Ahmed emphasized, is not a thing. Like class, nation is a process, is a terrain of struggle. To critically examine nationalism in a Gramscian sense requires us to study historical trajectories of class struggle. Likewise, the Gramscian concept of consent. Ahmed reminds us that Gramsci's immediate concern was not consent to parliamentary democracy, but consent to fascism. Gramsci struggled with how best to understand mass consent in Italy for the fascist project of Mussolini and how to combat it. Fascism, Ahmed insisted, is a kind of nationalism, competing with the historical traditions invoked by other forms of nationalism, such as anti-colonial nationalisms. Fascist movements unified diverse social strata by distilling the lingering rot of an anachronistic history, endowing these new unities with power, purpose, and intellectual location. In India, at the heart of this lingering rot was a masculinist mobilization in the name of a unitary Hinduism. The image of the family was crucial to Hindutva, drawing in its strictly all-male fronts through the centrifugal forces of patriarchy. In India, even after the destruction of Babri Masjid, a certain complacency about the fascist threat led many to feel free to carry on with our sectarian habits, focusing critical efforts within theoretical hermeneutics or against the organized left. The rise of extreme right movements in India, Europe, and elsewhere in the late 1980s occurred alongside the development of academic critiques of the nation as a political category and the deterioration of class analysis. As in the era of classical fascism, this took place in a period of capitalist stagnation, following the retreat from social democracy in the wealthy industrialized countries, the dismantling of radical nationalism in recently decolonized countries, and the demise of mass communist parties in Western Europe. Hindutva's rescripted nationalism, with its mythos of an eternal strong nation, marked a repudiation of the anti-colonial project, a willing subordination to imperialism. Although Hindutva developed in conditions specific to India, its rise in the early 1990s, Ahmed argued, exemplified a general tendency across the world at that moment. Movements of the extreme right stabilized the twin defeat of communism and anti-imperialist nationalism, cementing the triumph of imperialism in a moment of capitalist stagnation. In this historical moment, he continued, neoliberal economic policies combined with irrationalist populism to provide a general solution for the period of stagnation. Reading Gramsci can help situate these developments in a longer historical trajectory. For Gramsci, Ahmed points out, it was only in May 1871, after their decisive victory over the Commune, that the French bourgeoisie was able to stabilize its rule, thanks to a new imperialist economy fueled by colonial wars in Africa and Asia. Contra Fukuyama, with his presentation of a timeless French Revolution as the endpoint of humanity's ideological evolution, Gramsci understood that the defeat of the Commune entailed the final exhaustion of the dynamics first unleashed in 1798. These are the terms: defeat of the working class and the rise of a new imperialist economy, not some timeless liberal democracy that lurked behind Fukuyama's thesis, the celebrant of mass murder dressed in professorial tweed. Fascism, Ahmed argued, has two faces. On the one hand, it involves massive cultural and ideological upheaval, deploying a machinery of terror across society. On the other hand, fascism involves a comprehensive economic restructuring, achieving transformations which the bourgeoisie had been unable to achieve through the existing channels of the liberal states. In this process, large segments of the capitalist class are brought over to the side of fascism. Widespread passivity among the working classes and the peasantry, and simultaneous political and social initiatives in the hands of the professional classes and small business owners facilitates the rise of this pathological nationalism. To combat fascism, Ahmed maintained, it is necessary to remember that conservatism is born not only from privilege and the will to protect privilege, but also from the experience of pain and the fear of future pain. Amidst near universal misery in working class and poor communities across India's cities, the RSS offered compensatory hallucinations of power to address real and perceived suffering. In such a situation, Ahmed insisted, fascism can only be fought through the organization of a collective human agency, which addresses the linkages between moral reform and the transformations of material life. Fascism, in other words, can only be fought with class struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. Our next speaker is Matteo Capasso. Matteo is Marie Curie Global Fellow between Columbia University and the US and University of Venice in Italy. He is the author of Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, that reconstructs the last 2 decades of the country's politics leading up to the NATO-led regime change operation in 2011 that sanctioned its fall. His current research focuses on the impact of US-led imperialist policies and the political economy of war, sanctions, and militarism. He is editor of the academic journal Middle East Critique, and his work has appeared in several academic outlets, including Review of International Political Economy, World Review of Political Economy, Politics, Review of African Political Economy, Journal of Labor and Society, among many others. He is a special rapporteur of the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures. Matteo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bikram. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I also want to join everybody else in thanking you, the hosts, for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. Thanks, Radhika. Thanks, Bikram, Brendan, Paul, and everybody behind the scenes. It is great to be here with you, seeing also many familiar faces and comrades today online. I mean, I didn't expect this, but it seems that fascism is going to be a running theme now. Unfortunately, reality is imposing on us, and I guess we are the outcome of it in one way or another, also in our thinking. So today, my intervention, which I thought was going to be about sanctions, is actually going to have more of an existential tone. And I'm trying to reflect on the current geopolitical conjuncture by zooming into the role of Europe. I will be very honest with you. This is a rather painful exercise, especially in light of the ongoing war propaganda that it's taking place in the continent here. However, it comes without saying that it is a duty on our side to take up these painful questions in order to assess whether or not there is the slightest change or possibility for Europe to disentangle itself from the imperialist, US-led imperialist structure, thus becoming somewhat a progressive force for the good of the world, or the entire continent is destined to be consummated by the NATO-led appetite for war. It was the 2004, it was the year 2004, and the late Third World Marxist, Samir Amin, had already been able to foresee what kind of future was lying ahead for Europe. Amin, after locating Europe's history in the world history of capitalism, drew on Charles de Gaulle to describe how the continent was faced with a choice between two alternatives. On the one hand, and I repeat this is the year 2004, and de Gaulle words predate 2004, there was the alternative of Atlantic Europe, in which Europe becomes an appendage of the American project. On the other side, there was the option of a non-Atlantic Europe, one which would be able to live peacefully with its neighbors, integrating, hopefully, Russia. If Amin suggested then that this conflict over the alternatives was still not resolved, I would suggest that if we fast forward to the present, almost 20 years after we are in 2023, we can comfortably say that this conflict is almost resolved, and it has been resolved in favor of the Atlantic project. Quite unsurprisingly, I would say, considering the umbilical cord that unites Europe to the US. It comes without saying that in light of the visible decline of the US imperialism, the resolution of this conflict for Europe has not made disappear the existence of other contradiction within the same continent. So on one side, Atlanticism has consolidated the fascist side of Europe. And I have to apologize here why, because I'm perfectly aware, and this has been already mentioned by many, that for many countries of the global south, it is hard to accept that Europe has become fascist only now. After all, the history of colonialism and neo-imperialism tell us otherwise. So we can say that there is a new wave of fascism, which has new features as well. I don't aim to go into a comparison between the 1930s and today. There are certainly overlaps, but fascism today is also the direct result of the failure of the liberal project. Let me just remark that as the Indian economist Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik have aptly pointed out, this new fascism is based upon three major conditions which enable its rise. First, the existence of a crisis, the crisis being the decline of US imperialism faced by the rise of countries of the South, including the BRICS, that are demanding to be treated equally in the world stage. Then we have the Western ruling class incapable to overcome this crisis, since it would mean accepting these players from the South equally, and that's not going to happen. The third, and this is what I personally consider the most critical aspect, and I speak as an Italian as well, the complete state of disarray of the left in Europe, and more, the left in Europe and more widely the left in the West. The left, and I was reminded when I was listening to Manu about the words of Gramsci, trying to diagnose the state of the left. The left has lost its compass. This is the result of a lost historical process, as we all know. After all, the creation of so-called Western Marxism, which renounced to establish an organic connection with countries of the global South, by organic I also mean theoretically, has only generated a new form of cultural imperialism. We know better how to do Marxism, basically. One of the key aspects that come to mind is how there is an increasing incapacity to differentiate between the importance of the national question for the development of progressive forces in the south of the world, a key feature of the anti-colonial struggle, and the existence of fascist nationalism. And I can see this happening really very much here in Europe. So whereas Western Eurocentric Marxism has excommunicated the majority of the world from the left, as Domenico Losurdo, the late Italian Marxist, used to say, I believe it has basically accelerated its end. Now, this new wave of fascism is facing us with novel characteristics. In a way, we could talk of a so-called fascism with European characteristics. So one is the increasing centrality of war to the economy of Europe. Ukraine is the only stage of what we're currently seeing. What is most worrying is how the economies of European states have developed a voracious appetite for war, forgetting about the plight of their working classes. We've seen this happening in France, in Italy, everywhere. Now, war is a double-edged sword, we can say. It is the response to a crisis, and it's being normalized. On the other, we might say that, and this is where I'd like also to hear other comrades' thoughts, war is also symptomatic of the changing of objective conditions, which might offer an opening for something more progressive. Maybe this is wishful thinking, but I'm forced to look for the light. Second, there is a renewed sense of ideological mission for humanity. Basically, the war between NATO, the war on Russia happening in Ukraine, spearheaded by NATO, is attempting to revamp a discourse of democracy versus authoritarianism, which has always been there. While I believe that this renewed wave of Western-led, European-led salvation is not being silently digested by the working masses, it is nonetheless the ideological weight of the war. War must be justified, and this is how it's happening. One must also think about the absolutely disgraceful statements that are coming from top institutions and top diplomats of the EU. Like we're thinking about Joseph Borrell in the recent times, the whole garden jungle and more. At the same time, as much as Atlanticism and fascism are consolidating, there are also new contradictions emerging. There is, and there was, and continues to be, an increasing and clear division, smartly played by the Americans, between New Europe, comprising the ex-republics of the Soviet Union and Baltic states, and Old Europe. We can see this trend of thinking among numerous conservatives inside the American political class, from Donald Rumsfeld to Victoria Nuland. This division alerts us about the existence of potential frictions and divisions. We have seen, for instance, where the latest NATO meeting took place in Lithuania, and how the US had been pushing to have the former Estonian PM to head NATO. Overall, I must say that the outcome of this contradiction is very hard to predict. The most important one, obviously, is that the war-driven economy is undoubtedly crashing the working and middle classes of numerous European states. Let us think again of what has been happening in France. So while the objective conditions change and there is actually revolt taking place, unfortunately, and we were talking about this with Radik as well, the ideological grammar needed to articulate these protests is fundamentally fascist. So we go back here to the state of disarray in which the left is. So overall, to conclude, the state of Europe is rather worrying because, if we use the language of Mao, for example, war is just a way, it's the form through which the contradiction expresses itself. The problem is that the war and now has become the major shape. So the contradiction is all on war now. And as such, all the progressive forces, I believe, must be focused on pushing back against this war. In his essay on contemporary imperialism, Samir Amin bluntly stated that the policy of Russia to resist the project of colonization of Ukraine must be supported. But this positive Russian international policy, unquote, is bound to fail if it is not supported by the Russian people. In other words, this support cannot be won on exclusive basis of nationalism. It is true, but as Europeans, and again, I speak this, and it's very existential for me to talk about this, considering the state of disarray in which the content seems to head. This war is not a football match. We can't simply support one side or another. We must fight against the idea of war itself that is building up constantly, more and more. Dr. Fidel, when referring to a possible US-led war on Iran, he warned that since the US and its allies will unable to win the conventional war, they are going to use nuclear weapons. But that would be a war that they couldn't win because we are going to lose everything. I don't know why, but I feel that the warning of Fidel resonates strongly to the present conditions. And so I'd like to conclude more than with some final thoughts, more with some final questions. So for all the comrades that are here and for those following, online later on. And I wonder if, do European progressive forces exist that could contribute to stop this war? Can they play a progressive part in this fight? Or is Europe historically and organically located, probably like the US, in a position where no alternative can emerge and war will continue to resolve these contradictions? How are we posing ourselves vis-a-vis this? And I really would like to hear the thoughts of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Our next speaker is Radhika Desai. Radhika is professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada, where she is also the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. She is the convener of the International Manifesto Group. Her books include the recently released Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, Slouching Towards Ayodhya, From Congress to Hindutva in Indian Politics, and Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labour Party, which was a New Statesman in Society Book of the Month. Radhika, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Bikram, and thanks to all my panelists, co-panelists, and the audience. I think it's really an interesting discussion so far, and I can't wait to get to the question and answer session for a more open discussion. The title I've given to my talk today is a slight variation on the title of the panel. I have given my title as the Geopolitical Economy of Imperialism, Anti-Imperialism, and the Changing World Order. So that's what I'd like to address today. So everyone is aware that we are living through a moment of intensified imperialist aggression with war, of course, a proxy war against Russia already ongoing for more than a year. And in fact, for decades, I would say in some ways, and another one being waged against China so far in a hybrid form, hybrid non-military form, but we don't know where that is going. So it's really a time when understanding of imperialism and its history is desperately needed. However, what we find, and as some of the speakers have already alluded to, we're living in a time where the Western left in particular is basically on the back foot, throwing off a welter of confusing and confused concepts and theories and understandings. So, and many of the left are also indeed directly siding with imperialism, essentially calling Russia's actions imperialist, whereas, and therefore in that sense, something to be condemned and in effect standing with the West. So how did we get here? How did the left in particular get here? Where should the left really be? These are the questions that I would like to address. So to take the first question of how we got here, I would say that at the core of the disarray of the left lie two very important elements. One is that right from the late 19th century onwards, we had a situation in which more and more the parties of the left, particularly in Europe, were essentially became captive of a sort of guns and butter type reformism, in which the left ended up, or substantial sections of the left ended up accepting imperialism in return for some reforms at home, some reforms towards the working class. Of course, this reformism had to be then justified, and the intellectual path towards the justification of this sort of reformism took the form of a particular type of compromise between Marxism on the one hand and mainstream bourgeois science, particularly in the form of neoclassical economics as it had just emerged on the other. Just to remind people, neoclassical economics emerged in 1870, and just 3 years before the first volume of Capital had been published. Now, of course, I've written a great deal about this capitulation, and I don't want to go about it at great length. It would take too long. But the effects of that is what I would like to focus on at the moment, because neoclassical economics essentially portrays capitalism as harmonious, necessarily cosmopolitan, that is to say, necessarily a worldwide phenomenon, capable of being a worldwide phenomenon, and necessarily a Promethean system capable of developing human productive capacity forever. Now, insofar, and of course, Marxists did not accept the whole of this view, but it accepted sufficient amounts of this view to make a big difference to the kind of Marxism that they began to profess from this point onwards. So essentially, one of the most fundamental effects was to throw into doubt Marx's very central contention that capitalism was a contradictory form of social organization, that value production, which is the production of abstract value expressed in money, was inherently a quixotic enterprise subject to numerous contradictions. This notion went out of the window. And as a result, and as I will explain very briefly, capitalism's tendency to imperialism is precisely based in these contradictions. So if you do not accept that capitalism is inherently contradictory, then you cannot theorize the relationship between capitalism and imperialism adequately. So this became to plague the left. So there were sections of the left, particularly those connected with the journal New Left Review and Verso, etc., that in many of these writers actually came out and said, imperialism happens, it's very sad and bad when it happens, but it is not necessary to capitalism. Then there was the competing school, the Monthly Review school, which has a long and honorable tradition of opposing imperialism. But when they did so in a relatively untheoretical fashion, not directly connecting it to the core mechanisms of value production. Yes, they made a number of economic connections, but they were relatively unsystematic, far more so than Marx's very systematic account of capitalism as contradictory value production. And so there was as a result of this dichotomy, there was this dichotomy, and then within that and between that, a kind of more generic there was a more generic Marxist tendency to focus on isolated elements of the economic relationships. One example that always sticks in my mind is the notion that somehow imperialism has something to do with capital exports. But how can you make this the fundamental make this fundamental to the understanding of imperialism at a time when the leading imperialist country has long been a sinkhole for the rest of the world's capital? That is to say, not only is it not exporting capital, it is importing capital at a great rate of knots. It just does not make sense. So this is one tendency, and then this is associated with a whole range of other tendencies. The history of imperialism tends to get whitewashed with notions such as globalization, in which, you think about the capitalism on a world scale, not in the form of imperialism, but as though capitalism is simply spreading capitalist relations all over the world. Or you think of notions of hegemony, that somehow necessarily capitalism's development is connected with a series of leading countries organizing its productive expansion. But of course, we are now living at a time when capitalism seems unable to expand productively. And as I argued in my book, Geopolitical Economy, what's called US hegemony never succeeded as a project. And ideas of this succession of hegemonies and hegemony stability theory are less social scientific theories and more theoretical dress being given to this fundamental ambition of US elites. Furthermore, people argue that imperialism is a historical constant. Indeed, many authors think that they can show how radical they are by saying things such as imperialism is as strong today as it ever was. In fact, it is stronger. But the fact of the matter is, if we do not understand that the current crisis consists of the decline of imperialism and its desperation to hold on to what remains of its power, we will not understand this crisis. So anyway, in this context, then inevitably backwardness, the left is unable to challenge the notion that backwardness is somehow rooted in the original shortcomings of the poorer societies of the world. And that therefore their development, they must go through some kind of capitalist development, then a working class will emerge, and then it will fight for socialism. Well, if we are waiting for that to happen, we are going to wait for socialism for many more centuries, and by that time either nuclear war or climate change will probably have destroyed the world, if not some other problem of capitalism. Furthermore, so socialism is postponed to some indefinite future, and in this context, all forms of actually existing socialism, whether in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the past, or in China or Cuba or Vietnam, etc. today, all these socialisms are dismissed as productive and political failures, as dystopic societies which have failed, from which we have nothing to learn. And therefore, in the Western countries themselves, the left tends to focus on issues of redistribution rather than focusing on how the productive economy will need to be organized in order to deliver what the people need. Because the assumption of much of the left is that this latter issue, the production of what people need, this problem will be solved by capitalism. And we are again living in a time where ordinary people, even in the rich countries, are living lives where their needs are far from addressed by the existing capitalist system of production. But I would also say that because, and this thinking about the productive structure of society, since this is not done by the left also fails to understand a couple of really important things. Number one, that the prosperity of Western countries relies on imperialism. And if you're going to rebuild these economies on a non-imperialist basis, it's going to require a heck of a lot of effort. And this effort needs to be undertaken now if we are not going to allow fascist forces to take over. And the other thing that is forgotten is that the material achievements of actually existing socialisms in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, in China today, Vietnam, etc., these achievements are not appreciated, even though they have achieved extraordinary levels of development, not only without the privilege of imperialism. This is very important. They have achieved them without the privilege of imperialism, and they have achieved them in the teeth of imperialist resistance. So if you forget this, you are not going to understand how to rebuild productive economies in first world countries for a non-imperialist order. Okay, so these are the problems. So where should we really be? What are the solutions? And so I, in my own humble way, have proposed a new way of understanding world affairs, which I call geopolitical economy, and I invite engagement, development, correction, etc. But here's how far I've come in a broad outline. So it's a new approach to world affairs, which is rooted in Marxism, because I feel, and other compatible critical approaches, because I feel that these, particularly Marxism, still offers us the most penetrating insights into the workings of capitalism. And it's also an approach based on the experience of the third world. I don't live there anymore, but I was born and brought up there, and I was very much part of a generation that took India's own development to be key to the broader anti-imperialist project. It's not going as well as you might think. It's in fact going very badly, as Manu has already pointed out, but we can discuss that later. Now, the core concept here is the concept of the materiality of nations, not just classes. That is to say, nations are as material a product, nations and states are as material a product of capitalism as are classes and their organizations. And this is because capitalism is contradictory, and because it is contradictory, it always needs the state to manage its contradictions. And the state manages these contradictions both through domestic actions such as making concessions and reforms and so on. 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try and speed up. And through international actions. These international actions are, of course, they take the form of imperialism. And because they take the form of imperialism and because societies do not wish to suffer subordination very gladly, they are going to elicit the response of anti-imperialism. Imperialism seeks to ensure that imperialist private enterprise in imperialist societies have outlets for excess capital and commodities and can find territories in the territories that it subjects, both cheap resources and cheap labor. And I would say that these two sets of aims, outlet for commodities and capital and cheap resources and cheap labor, they are contradictory because achieving the first will endanger the second and vice versa. And I would say that the work of the Patnayaks in particular has made me aware recently that the historical development of imperialism so far seems to have prioritized achieving the second set of aims, cheap labor and cheap commodities, rather than the first set of aims. Now, okay, so what is the result of this? I'm going to jump over a couple of points that I made, and I'll try to conclude within the next minute or so. So the result is that essentially the imperial world has barely expanded since 1914. And indeed, this makes me really realize and makes me think, and this is a point I developed particularly in my latest book, is that you can, just as imperialism reached its high point in 1914, you can also say that in the early 20th century, capitalism had also reached its high point. Since it's all been downhill from there, except for the post-Second World War period, but that was exceptional because during this period, capitalism was essentially ringed around with socialistic measures. So that is what really explains the dynamism of the post-war period. The moment we went to neoliberalism, you can, for the last 40 years, have revealed just how senile capitalism has become. And it is precisely because it is no longer capable of making even the reformist concessions at home that the themes of fascism, which my co-panelists have emphasized so far, has become so relevant today. So, to conclude, therefore, the anti-imperialist stance has been essentially, has made the world multipolar, chiefly as a result of the development of the rest of the world, and chiefly in communist forms. That is to say, basically after the early 20th century, we haven't really seen successful forms of capitalist combined development. And this tells you that socialism is really necessary to achieve any form of anti-imperialist development. So the most important implication of this for me, I'm going to just jump over the next few points. Hopefully I can bring out my points later. But the most important implication of this understanding is that imperialism and anti-imperialism are primarily about development. Imperialism involves the denial of development, and anti-imperialism involves the assertion of the right to development. This contest is fought out through economic policy, and wars are the result of imperialism's inability to compel subordination through non-military means. I think I'll end here. Sorry if I exceeded my time.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Radhika. Our next speaker is Zubairu Wai. Zubairu is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Epistemologies of African Conflicts, Violence, Evolutionism, and the War in Sierra Leone, which won the Association of Third World Scholars Toyin Falola Africa Book Award for 2013, and is the co-editor of Recentering Africa and International Relations, Beyond Lack, Peripherality, and Failure. His most recent manuscript is Thinking the Colonial Library, Mudimbe, Gnosis, and the Predicament of Africanist Knowledge, which interrogates the contaminating vectors of the colonial archive and the implications for epistemic decolonization, which will be published by Routledge early next year. Zubairu, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Bikram. I want to start by thanking, like everybody else, Radical and the International Manifesto Group for organizing this meeting and for inviting this presentation. And to you, Bikram, and my co-panelists, Nina, Matteo, Mano, and everyone who worked behind the scene to make this possible. And thank you all for being here. It is exciting that we are actually having this conversation at a time when there is almost a totalitarian ban on free speech. The speech that is like sanctioned and the speech that supports the political position of the so-called collective West. So thank you very much. I feel alive. What I wanted to do, I titled this presentation, What Was the Sign of Libya? And given that I am like a hopeless rebelling Catholic, I still once in a while go back to the Bible. So there is this part where Christ is asked, and it's like, a wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, but there shall be no sign, be given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And then he goes on and stuff, right? And the capitalist and imperialist world is seeking after a sign. And the sign that I want to present is the sign of Libya. We all know what happened to Libya in 2011. At the time, I was like really, really upset, and I'm still upset at what happened to Libya. But the discourse is kind of similar to the atmosphere that has been created around the war in Ukraine, where you were not allowed to say anything that questioned the violent politics that was being unleashed right under our noses by creating what you want to call a moral panic about a deranged dictator that was giving Viagra to his soldiers to mass rape and murder his own people. Everything that we have now come to see to be lies and falsehoods, but this was what was happening. And many academics, even those on the left, could not touch Libya. And the thing that was so crazy about this is that, of course, when it comes to Africa and nobody really wants, there is always this need that there is a cleansing power of liberal intervention when it comes to darker races and darker people. So going to Libya to free the Libyans from this deranged dictator was one that was even, like I was at York University at the time doing my PhD, Bikram was there. Respected Marxist scholars were supporting the need to lie that they needed to go to Libya and destroy Libya. So Libya was destroyed. And I was one of the few people that actually wrote on Libya and said, but this represents a very violent intrusion and almost the perfection of imperialistic violence and militarization. So this is the way in which I looked at it. But actually, even myself did not consider the full implication of what Libya means to what we want to call world order. So in this presentation, I want to return to Libya. And what I want to do is I want to start by saying that Libya, actually, the sign of Libya is that Libya is a parallax. On the one hand, it is a sign of the spatial military logics of the liberal imperium, its oppressive powers, its totalitarian drive for world domination. So we've been talking about fascism, but the issue of totalitarianism is not even just in a particular system of governance in the West. The entire Western imperial system is totalitarian. And Libya, of course, really makes that very evident. And the second thing is that Libya also represents the militarization of global politics, the banalization of war, the routinization of intervention to advance and maintain the power of this totalitarian system that I'm describing. So on the one hand, Libya is a sign for the logics, the militaristic and imperialistic and totalitarian logics of our time. What happened to Libya? On the other hand, however, Libya is a perturbation to that system. It is a perturbation and a reaction to the logics of empire. It indicates the limits of imperial overreach. And if you want to doubt this, you can look at the blowback that is still playing itself out, not only in the Sahel region. So, I mean, Niger just had a military coup, and what they are doing is the French is now threatening to go back in. If our interest in Niger, basically the uranium mines, are threatened, we are going to intervene. So they are actually saying this. So it's not only that, it's not like the violence and the reaction in the Sahel region of Western Africa or Northwestern Africa, but it is also, we can also see that in the war in Ukraine. And I'm not even going to prevaricate around this and start mincing my words. The war in Ukraine, basically, I am saying is the lessons that are learned from Libya in a way that also is getting Russia to react exactly the way in which it is reacting. So what it signals then, and we are in this moment where we are talking about hegemonic or the transformation of world order. World order is in flux. The liberal unipolar order that came into being, you could say, if you go with Fukuyama, it's 89. If you go with George Bush Sr., the first president, it was after the Gulf War when he was trying to put in the new world order. So you could say from 1989, 1990 to 2002, or again, there you could say 2014 with the Maidan revolution or the Maidan coup in Ukraine, or Russia's military action in Ukraine in 2022. But this is the period where you had unparalleled liberal militaristic power that was suffocating everything else. So for the past 30 years, it was the American-led liberal militaristic system that was dominating global spaces, and the reaction to that in 2022 by Russia. Okay, so what I basically, in the paper that I published in 2014, I had attempted to consider the implications of Libya, not only for hegemonic rearticulation, because the argument that I was making was that Libya actually provided an opportunity for the West that was suffering a crisis of hegemony in the Middle East to be able to rearticulate itself as the defenders of democracy. So a moment of hegemonic unraveling also became a moment of hegemonic rearticulation. So that was the part of the argument that I had made, and also made the point that Africa was central to this notion of world order and the projection of Western power. And the conclusion of that paper was like, and I wrote at the time, is that as the liberal world order attempts to monopolize the global sphere and concentrate power in a technological machinery of violence and domination, and as it suffocates life through a totalitarian order that frowns on alternative modes of life, ways of being, forms of thought, and forms of knowing, and as it entrenches itself and attempts to concentrate its authority in a singular imperial network of power dominated by the United States, it also becomes vulnerable to its own violent and destructive inclinations. I wrote this not realizing the full implication of what it meant. And if you are wondering what the implication of that is, Ukraine is the implication. We are now talking about the end of the unipolar moment. Even realists are now saying we're in a place where now we have like a multipolar world order. At least there are three dominant powers: Russia, China, and the United States. So, and part of the reason why I was saying that the liberal world order, the American system, was undoing itself was because every machinery of domination Baudrillard tells us, always also secretes the counter apparatus and agents of its own destruction. There can never be an imperialism without an anti-imperialism. That's really the point that I'm making. There can never be a dominant power that does not also have opposition to its logics. So even, and Radhika is right, they're saying that even when the US tried to say we are hegemonic, we are dominant, you could only be dominant insofar as you try to like snuff out alternatives, but there are always forces that are articulating themselves in opposition to that domination. So, and for us to be able to understand then how Libya is central to the moment that we are in, maybe we have to actually take a longer view of history. The United States have always tried to be the dominant power in the world, at least post the Second World War. Sorry, Bikram, how many more times? Oh, okay, right. And so at the end of the Second World War, normally, like when I was in school, for instance, we were taught that, part of the reason why the anti-colonial struggles succeeded was because there were new powers, the Soviet Union, but also the United States was against empire. Actually, that's a lie. Right, because what the United States was trying to do is that the old imperial order that was based on Europe, it's like, well, we are now the new ones. And for them to be able to create this larger imperial order, they didn't need colonialism in the old sense of the word, where you actually occupy territory. What they needed was an informal empire that was based on, and we saw that in the Bretton Woods institution, the arrangement, the United States dollar became the dominant currency. You have capital controls, you have fixed exchange rate, and the policy of development that Truman put in place. But initially, it was articulated as one worldism. The Soviet rebellion leading to the Cold War then basically meant that one worldism had to be put up, but the US never forgot about its imperial order. So one worldism then became free worldism. And so in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, that the US idea of always being the dominant power was now realized with the end of the Cold War. And then 9/11 happened. So initially they were trying to like really go about it in a very violent way, but in a nice way in which they will say, oh, we are just promoting democracy and this. And then 9/11 happened. And it revealed, the title of that paper that I wrote actually is The Empire's New Clothes, which is like playing on the emperor's new clothes to say, there is naked violence that is embedded in this system that is being dressed up as liberal and concerned for freedom and human rights and all of it, right? And so from this, in the Second World War, from the end of the Second World War up to the 1990s, the Cold War was on, the Americans were unable to really realize their informal empire, even though they were racking up violence, targeting communism, alternative forms of socialist organizing and nationalist ideas, all of this. I mean, Africa has the scar of this. Angola, South Africa, Namibia, Algeria, you name it. And then the Cold War ended, and Bush was like, okay, one worldism now could be realized in the new international order. Okay, and so with the end of that, with 9/11, when the Americans have become so violent, and reaction in the Middle East through the so-called Arab Spring, there was the crisis, and that crisis had to be mediated. And the only way to mediate that crisis was to go after Libya. But the argument that I'm making then is that going after Libya also actually sowed the seed for the destruction of this movement, because Putin was not president of Russia at the time. But if you listen to his speeches around this period, he was very angry at what was happening. The Chinese, their embassy had been bombed already in Yugoslavia in 1999. And then Libya, and they were lied to at the United Nations. So when the same thing repeated itself in Ukraine, basically it got to the point, what the Russians were doing, we need to rebuild our productive forces. That's why everybody was like, why didn't you intervene in 2014? Because if they did, their economy would have been destroyed. But between 2014 and 2022, they were actually able to extricate themselves in a little, and China was able to rebuild itself. advance its economy in a way that created the possibility for what Russia is doing. And that is now responsible for the conversations that we are having at the end of this violent system. I'll stop there because we're running out of time. But the point that I'm making is that then we have to take Libya seriously. And we have to take the forces that were articulated, the politics that was unleashed in Libya, is central to understanding what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in the world in terms of rethinking world order. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Zubairu. He's sitting across the table from me, so I got that in live effect. So that was even nicer in person. Okay, so I was scheduled to be the final speaker. We are kind of pushing up later into the session, so I'm gonna give my comments, but I'm gonna kind of cut them down and try to be as brief as I can. And then we'll have time for a Q&A period afterwards. So I'm going to, in many ways, my comments are similar to some of what Radhika in particular raised. I think there was I'm going to begin just briefly with how I understand imperialism as the definitive contradiction of capitalism as a world system, right? So I think many of the things that Radhika said, I would agree with. In terms of thinking about imperialism as a system structured, as the Panaics have argued, as enabling a drain of wealth, a drain of value from periphery to core, right? This often happens through the cheapening of labor in peripheral countries and through the extraction, obviously, undervalued resources from periphery of core, and something that Nina had mentioned, the destruction of the productive forces in the periphery. And so this has been really core to the operation of capitalism since its inception, right? This has been a really core contradiction there. But underneath the capacity to appropriate value, to drain wealth from the periphery of the world system to the core, underneath this, I think, and this is really fundamental to imperialism, is this distinction between who can be sovereign and who is denied sovereign capacity. Right now, so the question of sovereignty is really central, in my view, to understanding an imperialist versus an anti-imperialist world system, right? So in an imperialist system, the integration of peripheral states into, let's say, what I think Radhika very nicely denigrated as globalization as a capitalist ideology, but as the form in which peripheral states are integrated into trade, into international institutions, is of a sort that their participation is oriented towards the development of the core, not towards their internal development. But this is only possible if those states themselves do not have the degree of power and force necessary to assert sovereign control over their resources. And imperialism does this. And here I'm going to go to Samir Amin, right? Samir Amin, I think in the same essay Matteo had cited, speaks of imperialism walking on two legs. And he also speaks of the need, therefore, of anti-imperialism to walk on two legs. So this denial of sovereignty that imperialism imposes proceeds through two legs, an economic leg and a military leg. And I'm going to try to emphasize both and the dialectic between the both, and how they're sometimes in tension with one another, both in terms of imperialism and anti-imperialism, right? So obviously violence seems quite central and evident in the sense that sovereignty can be denied through the application of greater force, right? Through the compulsion of greater military force that can force peoples and states and political authorities to orient themselves towards the more dominant military power. Economic leg, Amin argues, Samir Amin is really arguing that this is something that's really pivotal to understanding the contemporary moment. The economic leg is achieved through the monopoly power over capital, but especially over, let's say, the core technologies of capital, right? So we see a lot of discussions today around semiconductor chips and sanctions around that. So the denial of sovereignty is also enforced through monopoly over the principal means of production, right? So you might even have some levels of industrialization in the periphery, but the core technologies continue to be owned on a monopoly basis by the imperial powers. So these are the two legs that Samir Amin will argue that imperialism will walk on to force peripheral states to integrate into the system in ways that underdevelop their societies and develop core states. There is potentially a third leg that we might want to add to this discussion, which is the ideological leg that others have mentioned. And I think the left very often can fall into, maybe in losing sight of those two primary legs, economic and military, that ideological leg. And they often fall into what I have termed the Las Casas paradigm, right? In the way in which one of the early critiques of imperialism from the 16th century with the Las Casas, he argued for a recognition of indigenous peoples without recognizing their right to sovereignty. He wanted a recognition of their culture, of their knowledge, of their ways of life, even to go to something Radhika said, even a redistribution of wealth to a limited extent, right? Without actually threatening the sovereignty of Spanish imperialism over indigenous peoples, right? So the key question is sovereign reclamation. So how is this to be achieved? It has to be achieved on both the economic, military, and I guess the ideological leg, which I'll try to conclude with in about 5 minutes. So I think the case par excellence of anti-imperialism, or one of them of the 20th century, is the revolution in China, the People's Republic of China, spearheaded by the Communist Party of China, right? Now, this is obviously a revolution in which the question of force and violence was pivotal, where the Chinese Revolution effectively demonstrated, even before the Vietnamese Revolution, contemporaneous with the Korean War, a capacity to do what Fanon said was integral to anti-imperialism, is to return to imperialism a greater violence than that which it imposes on the peripheries. Now, of course, this doesn't sound maybe so nice to romantic and idealized decolonial ears, right, where we're supposed to kind of hold hands and sing our way to anti-imperial liberation. But we have to remember this was Fanon's imperative as well. So the revolution in China, through force, is able to then put in place the economic leg, right? So because there is not the same compromises that are happening, maybe that happened through the Gandhian politics in India, there's an ability to impose a different regime of property in China, vis-a-vis land reform, vis-a-vis nationalization, that enable the structural foundation for a form of economic development that Radhika was pointing towards, right? To generate domestic capital that can overcome dependence on the core through a process like land reform and nationalization. And so, although this was premised on, in the last instance, force, of course, Mao's famous dictum, as time went on, it became clear, even in China, that there was only so far that this approach could take China in addressing the deficit of capital and technology in order to continue to build power that can hold off imperialist counter-revolution. So of course, we know China then in the 1980s takes a different approach, where perhaps there's a compromise on the military leg, or let's say the leg of force, right? Where maybe China starts to integrate into the economic system in order to build more capital, to build more of that economic leg, economic power, which has had incredible outcomes. So we see the Chinese experience of an economic anti-imperialism through which it has been able to integrate into global markets, but to do so in service of its own internal development. But in doing so, it has maybe compromised on, at times, a military strategy of challenging Western capitalist military power in the 1980s or 90s, maybe going along more with certain military projects, right? But we can see the need, the strategic need, and in the end, by the 2000s, China has generated a level of economic development and a reappropriation of global surpluses that it can recycle into the global South and into the non-Western world, which has incredible dividends, which comes to be very threatening to Western capitalism. But here, Western capitalism, because it cannot compete with China on the economic leg, it returns to the military leg, right? And we see this, and we have to keep in mind, in many ways, the war in Ukraine is directed at China, right? We hear a lot of it being directed at Russia, but where I will point to people, and I've pointed this before, is in 2005, when it became clear to the United States that China had something to offer, not just to the global South, but to Europe. We have to remember in 2005, France and Germany were looking at the United States as a really irrational actor, right? There was a way in which China was seen as having something to offer that the US couldn't. And at this moment, Robert Kaplan writes an essay called How We Would Fight China, So of course, Robert Kaplan isn't the be all and end all, but it is kind of indicative of a certain trajectory in the US foreign policy establishment. And in this essay, and I'm going to read this quote, I've done this before, but it's just so telling. This is where you can see the United States returning to this military leg in its attempt to contain Chinese economic anti-imperialism. Kaplan argues, and this is where he's trying to argue that NATO is central to the US war on China, right? Kaplan argues that NATO is ours to lead, unlike the increasingly powerful European Union, whose own defense force, should it become a reality, would inevitably emerge as a competing regional power, one that might align itself with China in order to balance against us. NATO and an autonomous European defense force cannot both prosper. Only one can, and we should want it to be the former, NATO, so that Europe is a military asset for us, not a liability, as we confront China. So we can see the way in which wars were instigated in the 2000s to bring Europe back on side with NATO. We can see the wars in Syria, in Libya, the promotion of AFRICOM. In many ways, you know, AFRICOM, Kaplan in the essay talks about PACOM, Pacific Command, not an African command, as a means to contain China's growing economic power to be able to offer the global South in particular a different form of economic development. And so this military leg, though, whether it's the overthrow of the Libyan government or the attempt to overthrow in Syria, in Ukraine, these are threatening China's economic project, right? So I think then, as far as China has gone, the capacity of Hezbollah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, the capacity of Russia to be able to intervene in Syria at the moment that it did in Ukraine in 2014, this was a response to that military leg, right? And I think we see a lot of the rising anti-imperialism in the Middle East, for example, where we have, whether it's a group like Hezbollah defeating Zionism or the Palestinian National Liberation Movement that keeps getting stronger by returning a greater violence to colonialism, imperialism, those movements are recognizing that core to their success is the broader victory of anti-imperialism, right? That, say, suppose, for example, Palestinian armed movements will not succeed without the backing of Iran. And for Iran to succeed, however, even though China has not been active militarily, its capacity to help Iran withstand sanctions has been core to these national liberation movements in the region. So I'm just trying to emphasize this dialect, this link between the economic and military leg, as we've seen playing out, that both seem to have been necessary, even if one state, maybe a Russia or Iran, has been more explicitly confronting Western capitalism at a military scale. They are subject to economic sanctions that China's economic power can withstand. And then I think China's capacity to continue with this development is often necessarily dependent upon the capacity of military resistance in key regions in the world. And so I'll just conclude, what does that mean for those of us in the core? I think several elements here. Number one, then it's very clear, how do we walk on both of these legs? For those of us, I mean, not everybody perhaps here is in the core, but one is, I think, the incredible work being done that Nina is co-chair of. I was very honored to be invited to join, and I know others have as well, in terms of the People's Tribunal on Sanctions, is to link working class organization to opposition to sanctions, which is an attempt to weaken the economic leg of anti-imperialism, right? So to continue the work to build popular opposition to the sanctions regime is pivotal, and to oppose in whatever capacity possible the military-industrial regime in these countries. So we see direct action like groups like Palestine Action shutting down weapons factories in the UK. I know they have also factories in the United States and elsewhere, but to continue to build opposition to there. And then the ideological leg is to make sure that we fight against the confusions that Radhika and others have spoken about, the attempts to confuse the imperialism of Western capitalism tries to represent itself as an anti-imperialism, as an anti-racist project, to fight against that, to have clarity as to what's at stake in these conflicts. So I will stop my comments there, and we can open it up to questions and answers. I think before we did so, Alan with us? Did Alan Freeman with the IMG group was going to give some comments?
I'm here, and I just want to make a few remarks. I'm hoping I can share the screen. That's okay. So let's try it and see what happens. Okay. Everybody see that? Okay, if you follow our 3 sites, you'll see there's a sort of succession of things. The Geopolitical Economy Research Group says, think better. And then the next one, if I can get it to show, New Cold War says know better. And the International Manifesto Group says act better. That's at the top boundary, at the top. We spent a lot of time getting those logos to show you that. So think better, know better, act better. So I just want to talk about, thank all the speakers for this wonderful webinar and say to everybody who's here, thank you for coming. And if you want to get involved and act better, what can you do? And the best way to look at that is to visit our New Cold War News and Analysis site, click on any item, and you'll see 3 things you can do. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can subscribe. And you'll see the same if you go to any of our YouTube videos. So here's one. And this one will become, of course, live as soon as it's been video edited. And if you click on the More button after the comments below, you'll see here these 3 options: how you can donate, how you can volunteer, and how you can contact us. So we hope you'll join us. We hope you'll sign the manifesto if you haven't yet signed it. It's at 800. Let's get it to 1,000. We hope you'll volunteer. We are a grassroots organization. We have no collectivism. We have no big corporate funders. We don't even have any small corporate funders. We just rely on your money. And so the best thing for us is if you can do something regularly, even if it's small, either on Patreon or on, you don't now have to go through PayPal. We have another funding system which is much more friendly to non-profits and doesn't have an anti-Palestinian line like PayPal does. Just give us a monthly donation, even if it's small, and that gives us the security to keep on doing what we're doing. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bikram, for giving me the time for this, and let's have a discussion. I'll stop here.
Okay, so thank you. I see the comment from John. That's very important to keep in mind. So we can just open it up to questions that people can raise their hands and I can call on you.
If nobody's going to ask a question, I'll ask a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I was interested to hear the lecture on Libya. And I understand that Libya had a very high standard of living under Gaddafi, might even have been the highest standard of living in Africa. And I've tried to tell people that, but I don't have, any source I can reference to really make the argument. Is there something you could point me to where I would understand this better?
Matteo is the person you need to contact. Matteo, he actually has a book on Libya, fantastic book. Although I think he's not very radical in that book, as I have come to know him. But but yeah, you are right. I mean, in Libya, if you remember, there was a time when there were some Bulgarian nurses that were being tried because they said there was issue with infecting people with HIV and that kind of stuff. The issue, though, is that at the time of the NATO intervention, Libya had over 200 billion investment in Africa in different projects and all of this. Its medical system was like pretty robust. And the reason why I brought the Bulgarian nurses because Libya was actually bringing in experts to work in different areas. So that tells you in terms of the quality that they had, right? But Gaddafi himself, something had happened. So on the one hand, you move from, he started as a pan-Arabist. He was a Nehruist. not Nehru, sorry, what's his name? Nasserist. And then, then he tried his Green Book socialism. So Gaddafi himself is not this crazy, deranged person that has been presented in the media, because if you read him very closely, despite his failings, and we all do have failings, I'm not in any way trying to say that he was this perfect guy, but he was somebody who was remaking himself as he was going. He started as a Nasserist, then he went to Green Book socialism. Towards the end of his life, he had become a committed Pan-Africanist. He wanted to revisit Nkrumah's vision. In actual fact, the very AU is Gaddafi's brainchild. And so when people like you, they present him as this crazy guy, but this is somebody who took Libya out of poverty and made it to, like you were saying, one of the most, in terms of standard of living, perhaps the best in Africa. And yet we ended up basically just going after him, and to the point that the Africans themselves, they abandoned Gaddafi by the end of the day because the West could not allow them. The African Union came up with a peace plan. And they were like, so if you notice the way in which Africa normally gets talked about in this area, they will be like, the African Union says this, but the international community does not agree. So basically, Africa is not part of the international community. Mm-hmm. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, I think Mateo has more information on this than I do, because he has spent some like really serious time researching this.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mateo, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I could just add that there is, unfortunately, there's very little, there has been a systematic, revisionism when it comes to Libya, which allowed what happened in 2011 to identify the crazy dictator. We're going back to the 70s with this. You just need to read the CIA documents to realize how much this was being, was taking place. So unfortunately, that's the result. When it comes to the actual sources, I mean, I have written a few things online. You can just Google some of my work, and if that's not unfortunately open due to the crazy academic environment, but feel free to drop me an email. I'll be more than happy to send you even a copy of my book.
Okay, thank you, Mateo.
Okay, I have Norman and Barbara. So Norman, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Great presentations. I would like to hear some of you address the issue of what do you think is the goal of the new rules-based order that Blinken and obviously they're rolling out right now, that seems to be in part designed, and this is working hypothesis of mine, to perhaps replace the international system in the United Nations, et cetera, perhaps with a new system. We have seen, like, for example, recently that the United States is making it very difficult for Lavrov and his delegation to go to the United Nations. We have seen United States interfere with arrangements that were made by the United Nations. For example, there was an agreement to fund vaccines and PPE for Venezuela. That was arranged by the United Nations. The United States pretended to agree with it, but has basically sabotaged it. And there are other examples of how the United States has interfered with different resolved mechanisms for in its functionality. It just seems like there's a larger play happening here, and I would like us to think about where is this going, because clearly it's being used as a weapon. We know that, political weapon, but how serious are they about replacing the post-World War II architecture, the international architecture? Thank you.
Okay, Thank you, Norman. I'm going to take Barbara and John just so we can get more audience comments, and then we'll come back to the speakers. So Barbara, please go ahead, and then John, you can go after Barbara. Barbara, are you there? Barbara Foley?
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I'm sorry. I always screw this up. Okay. Two questions. Well, one is specifically to Matteo, and it's partly because I'm in Italy right now and spend a lot of time here, and I suggested this briefly in the chat. Now, what does he think are the implications for a possible, right-wing international, fascist international in Europe, and what the implications are, which is not to say that the liberals and social democrats haven't completely paved the way for it. They have. In some ways, they're fascists in different kind of clothing or something. But I think there's, something really serious, happening here. And I just wondered whether Matteo has any specific implications, comments on that, and the implications, of course, for worldwide imperialism, the egregious racism, which is manifested by the way in which European nations have been responding or not responding to the scores of bodies that wash up on the shores of the Mediterranean, et cetera. So that's a question specifically about Europe. The other is for anyone here. I'm a kind of confirmed skeptic of nationalism in all forms, including revolutionary nationalism, though I know it's not the same thing as bourgeois nationalism. And I just wonder whether the use of the sovereignty is a kind of feel-good way for bringing nationalism back into the equation, back into the political analysis, which sort of obfuscates some of the class contradictions in parts of the world that can be characterized as peripheral. I really think we, in this moment, need to be on the lookout for ideas that have been harmful to our movement in the past many decades, and to see whether they might be re-entering through a different kind of language. So that's a skeptical kind of remark, and I'd be curious to hear what anyone has to say.
Thank you, Barbara. John, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bikram. Yes, very briefly, given the time, they're certainly in the West, by kind of call them liberal forces, there is a perception that Russia is the empire, or is one of the, relative to the US. And, based on, the historic relationships through countries in the Warsaw Pact, et cetera, et cetera. Is it possible to think of Russia perhaps as a defensive empire, given the enormous number of nationalities that make up the state of Russia? Anyway, just a thought.
Okay. Thank you, John. Okay, I have Jim, David, and Francis. We have three sets of questions. I know Francis said in the chat that wanted to respond to the nationalism and sovereignty point. Maybe if Jim and David, if you can ask your questions maybe very quickly, and then I can kind of try to group them all and send them back to the panelists. Jim, did you have a quick question? Jim, are you there? Jim?
Bikram, I see
three sets of questions. I know Francis said in the chat that wanted to respond to the national sovereignty point. Maybe if Jim and David, if you can ask your questions maybe very quickly, and then I can kind of try to group them all and send them back to the panel. Did you have a quick question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Is my voice coming through? Thank you. My question would be, thank you for your presentations. I'm here. I've written my question in the chat. You can't hear me? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I see your.
My question would be, what does the panel think about the grain deal between Ukraine, Turkey, and Russia and the United Nations, which has seemingly broken down? And how do you analyze that? Because one could, of course, analyze it very simply, that it is a strategic move on the part of Russia to hurt the Ukrainian economy. But then, of course, we have these other impacts of exports of grain around the world? Thank you.
I'm getting some strange feedback. I'm not sure why, but okay, David.
Okay, hi. I'm talking about 15-minute smart cities. They take away your rights and freedoms. You got to have your force vaccinations. They control your banking. They can tell you what you can do, what you can and can't do with your money. You know, where you can work, who you can marry, and so on. You know.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, Francis, did you want to respond to the sovereignty nationalism question?
Okay, nobody's saying them to say something.
So on. Francis, are you there, Francis? Okay, all right. Okay, Mamadou, be real quick.
Thank you so much. It's so good to see everyone. My quick question was, given that so many speakers have spoken about the primary contradiction being one of imperialism and anti-imperialism, what do we make of, like, let's say what's happening in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso when leaders adopt an anti-imperialist stance, but not expressly a socialist kind of path? Thank you.
Okay, so we have some questions on the table around the, okay, Francis is back. So Francis, can you begin the responses to the question? Maybe I know you wanted to jump in on the nationalism sovereignty one. We have a similar question from Mamadou right now as well, but yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, you can still hear me? Okay, yeah, so for Barbara Foley, I think I got the first name right. I'm not seeing it anymore. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that question of nationalism a lot these days, and the relationship between sovereignty, and especially from the historic kind of feminist critiques of nationalism as connected to certain kinds of family form. But then I also I'm sort of aligned with Palestinian revolutionary nationalism at the same time. But I increasingly do think we need to think about sovereignty, but maybe not in Malthusian terms. And there are other kinds of mobilizations of sovereignty, like including indigenous mobilizations and thinking about sovereignty that isn't Malthusian, but yeah, so that's one thing. There are these interesting indigenous thinkings about sovereignty, but then I'm also just increasingly thinking about state or organized political power, and what does it mean to, I don't know, not think about to think about what it takes to sort of organize economics, politics, distribution. And so I go back to, I don't think nationalism is that great of a term, that it captures a lot of different things. And I feel the same way about sovereignty. But I don't think we've quite figured it out, but I don't know. Those are the issues that were triggered for me by your comment and question.
Okay, thank you, Francis. I'm just going to be very brief because I brought up sovereignty quite a bit in my talk, so I'm just going to briefly address that one point. I think I do think sovereignty is central. I don't think all nationalisms are the same. I think that's something, you know, I share this often. Radhika is my teacher from undergrad, and I know that's something Radhika emphasized a lot back then too. Not all nationalisms are the same. Not all national projects are the same. That we have to distinguish between, say, cultural nationalism and developmental nationalisms. But I will defer here to Frantz Fanon, who argues, and people misread Fanon. He doesn't reject nation or nationalism, and I agree with Manu, and I hope Manu maybe has time to add to this around the way in which the idea of the nation or the category of the nation, the ideology around the way in which a certain post-structural, postmodern politics kind of really pushes us away from engaging with the national question as it's been in our tradition, right? But what does Fanon say? He distinguishes between a bourgeois nationalism and a proletarian or a peasant nationalism. A nationalism that is structured upon land reform and land redistribution, right? Versus one that is structured upon a bourgeois neo-colonial road. So I would invite Barbara and others who have these concerns to read Fanon's chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, which is very clear that internationalism requires first a kind of a class-based national project that is centered on the peasantry or the working classes. So I'll stop my comments there. I think maybe Radhika and Manu and Zuba and others might also, and Nina might have things to say about this. Radhika, you have your hand up, so if you want to go, please go ahead.
Sure. I wanted to say something about the nationalism thing. I mean, Barbara, I could talk for hours about this, but Bikram's already said a couple of things. I'd like to say that, most people think that Marx only talked about classes, but that is simply not the case. And I've shown this in great detail in my geopolitical economy. One of his quotes that really sticks in my head is a remark he made during his debates on free trade. He said that if these gentlemen, referring to his opponents, do not understand how one nation can get rich at the expense of another nation, how are they going to understand how one class can get rich at the expense of another class? So you see here nation and class put side by side very explicitly referring to national oppression and exploitation. And later on, in a passage that I consider to be the source, really, the Marxist source of geopolitical economy, his remarks on Henry Carey at the end of the Grundrisse, he very explicitly talks about how countries that are essentially assailed by the dominance of any country, so in this particular case, it was Germany being assailed by Britain's market dominance and therefore imperialism, they have to respond by organizing developmental projects of their own, which is exactly what I mean by imperialism and anti-imperialism, what Trotsky called uneven and combined development. Although Trotsky gave it the label, this idea is there in Marx's writing and in the writings of many other Marxists. So this is just a small flavor of what I could say. I want to address Norman's rules-based international order very briefly. I'd say that in the past, this idea was encapsulated in the notion of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was always really a form of imperialism in the sense that it was about opening up the economies of the rest of the world to the corporations of the United States and the West, so that they could fulfill their need for outlets for capital and commodities, as well as for cheap labor and cheap resources. So this is the essence of it. Today, they call it the rules-based international order, simply as a way of opposing their notions to the rules in international law embedded in the United Nations. They have never liked the United Nations. NATO was from the start a way of essentially having a mechanism for acting internationally that was not the United Nations, because the United Nations had too many of the riffraff of the world, the newly independent countries and so on, which the imperialist countries did not wish to consort with. And then just one couple of other points. The rules-based international order, however, today is not the same as neoliberalism. As many people have pointed out, they make these rules up as they go along. Why is that? Because maintaining a neoliberal stance is increasingly difficult for these countries themselves. So you get all sorts of protectionist laws that, say, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act that is being implemented, which is actually goes against the notions of neoliberalism. And because these countries in their current capitalist senility have to do this for political reasons, etc., this is also going to deepen the conflict among the various centers of capitalist imperialism between United States and Europe in particular. And this is part of the decline of imperialism. This is going to create a lot of friction among the allies. Yeah, and you know, Barbara, to Barbara Foley's question on fascism, I just wanted to share a thought. You know, it's true that, you know, when people are trying to understand fascism of our time, and naturally we are going to compare it to the fascism of the past, but one very common thing to say is, you know, the left is weak, so there is no fascism. You know, for the fascism to appear, there has to be a strong left, but there can be fascism that occurs because the contradictions of capitalism are multiplying, and they are putting the ability of the capitalist class to keep their hold on power, undermining the ability of the capitalist class to keep their hold on power. And then on the grain deal, I won't say anything more, but on the grain deal, I just wanted to say that I think people actually misunderstand. I mean, look, the West has always advertised the grain deal as though, you know, it's about feeding the world. But the West has been historically at the forefront of denying food security to the rest of the world. It has always said to the rest of the world, you grow for us the coffee and the cocoa and whatever, all the cash crops that can't be eaten, the cotton and silk and so on, and then you buy your grain from us. Of course, this has been the cause of widespread hunger in the world. The West has never actually fulfilled this promise, but on the lure of this, that, you know, you can always buy grain from us, they have actually undermined the food security of many countries. So there are many countries in the world that have become highly dependent on grain. That's the first thing. Second point is that the grain deal was never about feeding the third world. It was about getting grain out of Ukraine that is produced by big multinationals in that country, and they want to get it out because it has to go to the market. And without that, it's the interests of the big corporations that will be undermined. Putin has been very clear about exactly why he's negating the grain deal. He's pointed out that the West has not kept its promises. And what's more, it's not just that, it's that hardly any of the grain is actually ending up in third world countries, like less than 5%. Most of it is going to first world countries. What is the purpose of that? To keep inflation down. Remember, rise in food prices is a big cause of inflation today. So this whole sort of lament about how the third world is suffering, it's like crocodile tears for the third world. What is really happening is that the West is fulfilling its own corporations' needs, and it's yeah, I mean, it's just not going to work. So I'll end there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Radhika. So I'm going to go to Nina, Zuba, Mateo, and Manu, because they have their hands up, and then Manu, you can close us off there. So Nina, please go ahead.
Going back to Momodu's question, I want to say that I think some of our talks were quite depressing, or, you know, not so optimistic. But what I tell my students, and what I say when speaking in other spaces, is that this is actually one of the most exciting times to be alive, and to be able to witness. We just sent a fact-finding mission, a delegation of about 15 or 16 people. I mean, the People's Tribunal to Venezuela. And they visited the communes there, which Chavez talked about as being the backbone, the skeleton of the revolution in Venezuela. And so to be able to witness what's happening in Venezuela, and how it continues to survive despite unrelenting attacks by the United States, what's happening in Mexico, which is just, you know, I mean, it's been overwhelmed by the US, but they're managing to take some serious strides toward liberation. The rise of China, BRICS, the promise of a BRICS currency. I mean, to be able to witness this moment and participate in it is the most exciting moment of my life. And so I just wanted to say that, you know, despite, well, my talk of fascism. And so in response to Momodu's question, I think it's really hard to say. And I say that because there are many nations, and I would say the overwhelming majority of the world, they are opportunists. Many governments are opportunistic, many nations are opportunistic. And so, and Saudi Arabia is a prime example. Even France, I mean, a couple months ago, France was saying, you know, we need to really reconsider our alignment with the EU. I think a lot, they've been saying it a lot. We need to reconsider our alignment with the US. Saudi Arabia similarly is reconsidering its alignments. So a lot of nations are going to basically change teams, I think, or play both sides in this particular moment until the decline of the US is complete. It will be difficult to know exactly where the chips will fall. In response to the question about the rules-based international order, this is not new rhetoric. Bush 1 is famous for having said that rejecting the law of the jungle for a rules-based order, or something like a rules-based order. And so this is just sort of standard Western civilizational discourse and talk. And I'm not convinced that the US is capable or even interested in developing a new type of rules-based order anymore. I think Radhika is correct in her economic analysis of it. The US, if you follow regime change efforts that the US has undertaken over the last several years, they are no longer replacing unfavorable governments with favorable governments. They are now engaging in permanent war. So the war in Iraq is permanent, Syria, permanent, Libya, permanent. And so that is the method that the US is, the destabilization of Venezuela is another example. That's what's happening right now. It's war that is driving the new international order for the Americans, not rules. I want to thank, I may have to leave because I hear my son downstairs yelling at where's mama? But I want to thank, in case I have to leave early, I want to thank everybody. This has been lovely, and I hope we are able to continue the discussions.
Okay, so again, Nina, unless you get driven out by the Taliban in Afghanistan, but then the war continues. So I'm just responding to the permanent war piece. Rules-based international system or international order. In my presentation, I didn't really have time to go into this, but if you notice, the Americans have always done this. We moved from one worldism, and during the Cold War, it became free worldism. Free worldism is basically about that. It's just you giving it a different name. So China and Russia have fundamentally challenged this system. And so US dominance basically, or the dominance of the collective West under US leadership. And so the way to fight back is to say, we are defending rules. But for those of us who are colonized, it has never been about rules. Like, I don't know what rules they are talking about. When you go invade a country under pretext of, I don't know what they are talking about. When you could go to Iraq and destroy it, or you illegally are occupying Syria, and you say it's rules-based, it's rhetoric. It's a way of redefining a crumbling power in order to be able to say we represent something that these guys do not represent. So for me, I don't take it seriously. I think it's actually a drowning process, reaching out for straws. It's a way of trying to redefine their position and say, we are not really the bad guys. It's these guys that are trying to destroy the rules. I don't know what rules they are talking about. Libya is still on my mind. I don't know. I'm still angry for what happened to Libya. So I don't even know what they are talking about when they say rules-based international order. The grain deal. The nationalism. I think, Bikram, I'll just add something to what you said. For those of us who also come from societies that have been the target of repeated imperial encroachment, you need a strong state. I don't care what people say, because sometimes the strong state is the only, you can't mess with China. You know why? The answer is there. you can't mess, Nina, you are talking about Venezuela, even though Venezuela has been under attack, Vietnam, a strong state. So I think that the issue then is that Fanon should probably be our guide in terms of what kind of state we create and the forces that are mobilized in terms of the identity of that state and the politics that it practices. But I'm not against strong states. I think a nationalism plays a part in it. It's just that the way in which those forces get mobilized and the kind of politics or ethics that they aim for. But I'm not against strong state. And that takes me to Mamadou's question. I just want to say, for me, it is very simple. I would rather we keep trying and failing. Because like when it comes to especially Africa, we are never allowed to fail. And if you take the entire history of what has been happening in the continent, it has been one experiment after another under impossible odds because there is always the colonial gaze and pressure that it casts on these societies. So even if you take the one-party state that is supposed to be authoritarian and all of this, it was a way of thinking about, if we say we are going to pursue development, then the liberal notion of politics divides our societies in ways that are counterproductive. So why don't we use our human resources and political capital towards that end? Of course, it ended up turning out in different ways and stuff, right? And we could critique it for that. But I'm not just going to sit there and allow people to say, oh, the one-party state was a failure because of this, and therefore that means that Africans cannot experiment anymore with a particular form of regime type or politics. And this takes me to this issue of imperialism, anti-imperialism, right? And Nina, you are quite right. We are in a place, the world is in flux, and there are opportunism is part of politics. Some people are reading the situation and was like, well, we'll be able to return. But for me, I will also say it is up to us to mess up and fix it. And so there are those of us who will be saying, well, no, we have to go back to Fanon. We have to think about the kinds of forces that are able to really put in place an anti-imperial politics. I know there are reactions. Sometimes people just think that if you talk against the West, that is anti-imperialism. No, it has to be based on a concrete program as Fanon taught us. And I go back to Fanon because in the African context, Fanon, Cabral, what's his name? Nkrumah and Rodney should be and have been our guide. And I think that's what it is. So yes, you are right. Some of them are not anti-imperial. And actually, this guy in Burkina Faso, what he is doing is he has this image of Sankara in his mind so much that he's trying to copy him. But Sankara was organic. He was not forcing. This was something that was part of him. But I still would take him over the puppets that are licking the boots of France. So for me, let us mess up and let us try. Let us keep trying until we get it right. But if we say we're never allowed to make mistakes and we label everybody, and some of these guys are opportunistic, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, let us configure that within our own logics instead of somebody else always telling us which kinds of government that we have. So I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Matteo.
Thanks, everyone. I mean, it's a fantastic discussion. I just want to pick up on the question of fascism by Barbara, I believe. And I mean, it is, I'd like to go back to the work of the Italian Marxist, Domenico Losurdo, when he, in the counter history of liberalism. Why? Because I think that, we have a tendency to think that what happened after the Second World War was democracy, was liberalism. When we look at the way NATO infiltrated the European countries like Italy with the Operation Gladio, and we've seen this in all the different countries of Europe, there was already cooperation with Nazis up to that moment. I think that, and there were also an attempt to defeat the decolonization movement at that time, during the 50s, the 60s. So I think that was a fascist international. What we're seeing now, I think, is different. I think we're seeing contradictions rising out of, the drive for war. Capitalism is always as crisis, but I don't think it is always as resolved them through war necessarily. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg would say that, but I think in the financial age, militarism has really become a key element of the economy. So what we're seeing now, and I link this to what Radhika was saying, is that we can see fascism rising. But this is a type of fascism that is not united. It's fighting against each other. And it's more, I don't know if it's more, at that time they had an hegemonic bloc. They were fighting with, they were comfortable to come together with the Nazis to fight another power, they would say. Now, what you are seeing is that they don't have that hegemonic bloc anymore. And I think this is where they're fighting one against the other over the crumbs of the decline. It's two very different moments. And the problem is also that they are incapable of, they disenfranchised, the left has disenfranchised the working classes. The fascists don't have a big middle class base anymore. And at this point, I also would like to direct everyone to the comments that they were being made in the chat, where they were suggesting the reading also of that on fascism and social revolution, which I agree, they should be revisited. We should go back to these readings also to try to analyze the current moment.
Go ahead, Manu.
Okay. I guess maybe one place to begin is just reiterating imperialism is the primary contradiction, and that imperialism has no option but destructiveness. It's moribund capitalism. It's capitalism in an advanced stage of senility, to invoke the language of Amin and Radhika in her talk. And so there is no option but destruction. In the US, manufacturing is focused in the manufacturing of weapons. And that's relates to even, there's an attrition of a skill base. There are no machinists, there are no tool makers to switch to manufacturing, let's say, renewable energy products. And I'm speaking from the experience of my family and community here. It doesn't exist, it's been lost. And so if anything from solar panels to screws and bolts and ball bearings are going to be manufactured at scale for the US economy, they're going to have to be manufactured outside of US borders. I think this, to me, is related to the grain deal, the collapse of the grain deal. In the last week and a half, what we've seen is renewed aggressiveness of NATO naval forces in the Black Sea. And I think this has to be understood as we have to include that in trying to understand why Russia has responded in this way to the grain deal. There's serious military questions at play there, and questions of aggressiveness. And then I'll just end maybe with the question of sovereignty, and I think this is related. There's not just a national dimension to sovereignty, but as Bikram said, that we always need to remember the class dimension of sovereignty as well. That they're competing struggles over nationalism and the definition of nationalism and the capture and meaning given to national symbols. It's really striking that in Cuba and in Venezuela both, after the revolutionary process has been underway, they've kept the flag, for example. And if you talk to Cubans and Venezuelans, there's a great sense of national pride in the histories of liberation and the histories of anti-imperialist and anti-racist struggles in those countries. And so, if there's an aggressiveness and a destructiveness of imperialism internationally, that's also met within national borders. In the United States, people are roasting to death working on highways and delivering packages. So there's class war in addition to this imperialist international war. And, I think that raises questions for us. In the United States, for example, at least 30 million people are publicly aligned with the most explicit extreme forms of fascism, including using explicitly Nazi language in public. That's at least 30 million people. That's a real political conundrum we have to wrestle with. Those 30 million people include people who are working class people, who are living and surviving this escalation of class war. So I maybe just end with this question of the sovereignty. What kind of politics could make the working classes of Europe and North America actually sovereign? In my neighborhood here in Harlem, people are looking and studying very carefully the projects of housing and neighborhood clinics in countries like Cuba, in Vietnam, and China. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you, Manu. That was excellent. I think in many ways what you're prompting us to is what was at the heart of the 1848 revolutions, the sovereignty, who will be the sovereign basis of the emerging nation form, right? The working classes or the bourgeois. I just wanted to have one quick comment on the rules-based order, because I have a minor disagreement with a couple of the comrades' responses, saying that there is no rules-based order. I think there is. It's just not what it's presented as. So when we had this panel in Montreal in March, I kind of have this idea that I was working with the rule of property. So I think there's a way in which that when Anthony Blinken and whoever, they talk about a rules-based order, if you look at when sanctions emerge, right? Look at what that state is violating. There is a rule, but it's unsaid or unstated, right? So often it is those states that undertake a program of kind of nationalization of say nationalizing transnational capital, transnational property, threatening the rule of capital through a program like nationalization, land reform. Those are often what are taken as violations, and then a state is subject to sanctions or coups, right? So I think there is a set of rules that Blinken is gesturing towards. They're just not, they're framing them differently, right? And the example that I'll give, and this relates to, I think, Radhika's brilliant point on the grain deal and inflation. And I know, Radhika, you had earlier mentioned the Patnaiks, right? We have to recall that for the Patnaiks and all the discussion today of inflation, and you have a lot of left economists today almost embracing Bidenomics as a measure that has successfully contained inflation without too much hardships to the working classes. But these left economists are not reading the Patnaiks, who often argue, who have shown that the control of inflation in the core has historically depended upon imperialism. This was a key utility of imperialism, was the containment of inflation. Right. And so one way in which you contain inflation is you depress it's called demand deflation in the peripheries. Right. So one thing that is happening in our contemporary moment, and I mentioned this in Montreal, but I really want to keep this on the radar, is you look at the way in which this global South debt crisis is unfolding. And you see the demands that the IMF is imposing on Zambia, on Pakistan, or other states, right? If you take the example of Zambia in particular, what they are demanding is that Zambia withdraw all of its development expenditures. This goes to Radhika's point around the difference between redistribution and productive power, right? Having a productive economy. So all of the Chinese financed power plants and productive investments, Zambia is being forced to kind of close down, and any aid or funding they're going to get to address the debt crisis can only go to recurrent expenditures. Right, that's not going to lead to a higher productive capacity, which is going to deflate Zambian demand for Zambian resources, which is going to open up, again, mineral wealth and other wealth for appropriation by the core for a green transition, for lithium, for whatever it is. This will be able to repress inflation and the cost of production in the core. Right, that's a key element, I think, of the rules-based order, is keeping in place certain property regimes, certain relations of power that can export inflation to the periphery to contain inflation in the core. And that has been entirely missed in a lot of the contemporary analysis of the celebration of the Inflation Reduction Act. How does the increase in interest rates, how has that played into a debt crisis, which is now being used to impose a structural adjustment 2.0, 3.0 on states in the periphery? So I just wanted to maybe add that to the discussion on inflation that was brought up earlier. I'm seeing we're at 1:30. Radhika, what's your sense of things? Shall we close it down?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, maybe Norman may want to have a
Sure.
quick last word, but that
Okay.
can be the last one.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Norman.
if I could just speak to, what were the two big bills that they passed? The infrastructure bill and the IRA bill were both sold politically as anti-China bills, but they're also about nearshoring production because we are in a pre-war period. They are preparing to go to war against China. I want to remind everyone that the general in charge of logistics for the entire US military told his subordinates that we will be at war with China in 2025. Okay, so clearly they're nearshoring, and I agree with, I believe, with the gentleman before. They're coming from a very low place in it because they don't have enough machinists and tool guy workers. I come from a German immigrant family here to the United States of those people, but they have this necessity that almost, literally 80% of renewable technology comes from China. Solar panels, batteries, right? And you see how they're caught in a contradiction, because if they go to war against China, if war starts, they will not have access to everything they promised the young generation who they are lying to, that they are really concerned about global warming. These are lies. They are burning. Biden is drilling more natural gas and oil, new oil sites than Trump was. And they obviously blew up Germany's pipeline, the Nord Stream, in order to sell LNG gas from here, which they were planning for years. So we're in a pre-war period. They're nearshoring, frantically, not only to the United States. It includes the what was formerly NAFTA to Mexico. If you notice, you're seeing production going to Mexico and also to Canada. Volkswagen was supposed to open up a new manufacturing plant in Poland. They switched it to Canada. Okay, Tesla opened up a new factory here in Mexico, and also BMW or Mercedes, I forget which, opened up a new factory. But we're seeing this nearshoring. Because if, again, they have this contradiction, as their proxy war Russia shows, they simply don't have enough industrial capacity to even supply Ukraine's army with ammunition. That is why Biden said to the reporter as he walked out the room that we have to give them cluster bombs because they're running out of ammunition. And of course, they're all making a killing from it, as always, in both senses, right? So I think we should not underestimate how much their necessity is in trying to, restore, for example, trying to lure, part of the infrastructure bill was getting Taiwan, their semiconductor factory, to come and build a facility here in the United States, right? So again, they are trying to do that. I don't think they're going to succeed fast enough. But clearly, if they intend to go to war in 2025, as the general said, they will have to, nearshore a lot more production to the United States.
Excellent. Thank you, Norman. Those are some very important points, I think, to close on. So I think we're out of time. Radhika, did you have any final? Okay. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to the speakers for some excellent presentations, and to the audience for the great questions. Thank you all.